Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping into something pretty fundamental today, the very foundations of psychology. You've shared some great source material with us, which is basically a map of where this huge field came from and, well, what it's all about.
That's right. And our mission really is to navigate that map together. We want to, cut through some of the detail and pull out the most important nuggets, the core ideas, the sometimes bumpy historical journey, why it even calls itself science, the incredible variety of things psychologists actually do, and how they go about figuring things out. It's kind of your shortcut to really grasping what psychology is at its roots.
Yeah, think of it as tracing the path from, say, ancient philosophers wondering about the soul, all the way to modern scientists looking at brain scans and, social behavior. It's really a story about understanding ourselves, and it touches practically everything. So let's dive in.
Okay. So the source starts right at the beginning with the name itself. Psychology. It comes from the Greek words psyche, which meant soul or life, and logos, meaning knowledge or explanation.
Soul. Yeah, that makes sense given those early philosophical questions, doesn't it?
Exactly. The term itself actually popped up way back in the 16th century. It got a bit of a push in Germany in the 18th century with Christian Wolff, and then became more established in English with people like Herbert Spencer in the late 19th century, his Principles of Psychology.
But that idea, studying the soul, it's sort of evolved, right? Psychologists eventually landed on a more concrete definition.
They did, yeah. The most widely accepted definition today, the one you'll usually hear, is that psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes.
Okay, science of behavior and mental processes. That's the core. Let's break those parts down so they're really clear. What do they mean by science in this context?
Right. So when psychology says it's a science, it means it uses a systematic approach. It's not just, armchair speculation. Researchers observe and record what people or animals do in a structured way, often under controlled conditions, trying to measure things objectively. And the goal, ultimately, is to use that knowledge to understand and maybe even solve problems in real life.
Got it. So structured observation, trying to be objective, applying the findings. Okay, what about behavior? Seems straightforward, but the source expands on it a bit.
Yeah, behavior is basically anything an organism does that you can observe or record. That includes the obvious stuff like walking or talking, but also things like facial expression, showing emotion, or even things like writing down your thoughts or your heart rate changing. It's the outward stuff.
And mental processes. This is the part you can't directly see, right? The internal stuff.
Exactly. These are the internal private experiences, thinking, feeling, remembering, dreaming. Psychology aims to understand these internal processes too, often by observing behavior and then using other methods to infer what's happening inside.
Okay, so science, observable actions, internal experiences. The source mentions the APA definition too, which kind of reinforces this.
Right, the American Psychological Association. They call it the study of mind and behavior and emphasize that the core enterprise is the understanding of behavior.
So, bottom line, the goal is?
Well, as some earlier researchers like Morgan, King, and Robinson put it back in '84, the big picture goal is really to understand and predict both human and animal behavior.
But calling it a science, that was a big shift, wasn't it? It wasn't always seen that way.
Oh, definitely not. Its origins are, they're fascinating because it sits right at this intersection. On one hand, you have philosophy asking those big questions about existence, knowledge, the mind. And on the other, you have physiology, the study of how the body works, which is a natural science, the conceptual foundations, the what is mind, questions that are in philosophy.
The long past.
Exactly, the long past. But the idea that you could study the mind scientifically, that really came from the methods of biology and physics. That's the short history.
So it's like the thinkers asking, what is the mind? Met the researchers who were, measuring reaction times and looking at nerves.
Pretty much. They looked at the successes in other fields, like physics with Newton's laws, or biology with Darwin's evolution, or even chemistry with Mendeleev's periodic table, and thought, hey, maybe we can find the fundamental elements and laws of the mind using similar experimental rigor.
And the source mentioned some key scientific assumptions psychology adopted.
Yes, things like natural modism, which is sort of like reductionism, trying to simplify things to their basic parts, and operationism, the idea that a concept is only valid if the way you measure it is valid, and determinism, the idea that our actions are basically determined by heredity and environment, though that one's debated, of course.
But it also mentions psychology as a social science. How does that fit?
Well, yeah, while it uses experiments and statistical analysis like the natural sciences, it often deals with complex human interactions. So the social science perspective acknowledges that maybe there are fewer rigid assumptions when you're studying people in groups or societies. It still uses scientific methods, though.
And you mentioned observation. The source really emphasizes the empirical approach.
Absolutely foundational. Empiricism, this idea, going back to philosophers like John Locke, basically says that true knowledge comes from what we can observe through our senses, experience. Psychology, as a science, really relies on collecting data through observation and experiments. It has to be grounded in empirical evidence.
So it's empirical, data-driven. It tries to be systematic, objective.
Precisely. Researchers gather info, analyze it, often statistically, within a framework that others can hopefully replicate or verify. This allows them to build theories to explain and predict behavior, and then those theories guide more research. It's a cycle.
Now, when they study people, does psychology try to find general rules that apply to everyone, or is it more about understanding each person uniquely? The source mentions nomothetic and idiographic approaches.
Ah, yes, that's a really key distinction, kind of a tension within the field sometimes. The nomothetic approach. That's about establishing general laws or principles of behavior. It tends to look at large groups, use statistical averages, and generalize findings, often ignoring individual differences to find those common patterns.
Like finding the average reaction time or, I don't know, the stages of memory.
Good examples, yeah. It's looking for the universal rules. Then you have the idiographic approach, which is almost the opposite. It focuses on understanding the specific individual or event in depth. It sees each person as unique, shaped by their particular history and psychosocial environment.
Like a case study.
Exactly. Case studies are a prime example of the idiographic approach. Deep dive into one person's life.
It makes sense you'd kind of need both, right? Because we have things in common, but we're also definitely unique individuals.
You absolutely do. It's a balance.
Okay, so let's trace that history then. You mentioned the long past and short history from Ebbinghaus.
Right. Hermann Ebbinghaus famously said, "Psychology has a short history but a long past." The long past, as we said, is those deep philosophical roots in ancient Greece. Socrates urging, "Know thyself," through reflection. Plato, Aristotle, pondering the relationship between the mind and the body, those fundamental questions.
And later philosophers, too, like Descartes, with his idea about the pineal gland being the seat of the soul.
Right, trying to pinpoint the connection. But the real shift, the start of the short history, happens when people began applying scientific methods to these questions. Gustav Fichtner, a German physiologist, was a key early figure. He started studying psychophysics, trying to precisely measure the relationship between physical stimuli, like light intensity, and our subjective mental experience of them.
Trying to quantify the mind-body link.
Exactly. But the really big moment, the one usually marked as the official birth of experimental psychology, that's Wilhelm Wundt.
Often called the father of experimental psychology.
That's him. In 1879, in Leipzig, Germany, Wundt established the very first laboratory specifically dedicated to psychological research. His work, like Principles of Physiological Psychology, really set the stage. This was it, psychology carving out its own space as an experimental science.
Wow, 1879. That's the date to remember. And that experimental idea spread pretty quickly, didn't it?
It really did. One of Wundt's students, G. Stanley Hall, was crucial in bringing it to the United States. Hall set up the first formal psychology lab in the U.S. at Johns Hopkins University in 1883. He also became the first president of the American Psychological Association, the APA, when it started in 1892, so things moved fast.
And around the same time, William James published his big textbook.
Yes, William James, another hugely influential figure. His book, The Principles of Psychology, came out and was incredibly important. So think about it. Within about 15 years, you have the first lab, the first major professional association, and a foundational textbook. The field was really taking off.
And as it grew, different ideas about what psychology should study and how it should study it started to emerge. These became the different schools of thought or perspectives our source talks about.
Exactly. You can think of them as different viewpoints, different lenses, focusing on different aspects of the mind and behavior. And they often disagreed quite strongly.
Like the very first one, structuralism. Trying to break down the mind, right?
Yes, associated with Wundt and his student Edward Titchener. Their goal was to analyze the basic structure of the human mind. They tried to break down conscious experience into its simplest elements, sensations, feelings, images, using a method called objective introspection.
Objective introspection. Trying to look inward objectively.
Yeah, examining your own thoughts and feelings in a systematic, objective way. It was the first real attempt at measurement, but, well, it proved difficult. How do you verify someone else's private experience?
Right, which maybe explains the next goal, functionalism.
Yeah.
Asking what the mind does instead of what it's made of.
Precisely. People like William James and John Dewey were less interested in the static parts of the mind and more interested in its purpose. How do our mental processes, thinking, learning, remembering, help us adapt to our environment, survive and function in the real world? This was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection. They applied that thinking to psychological characteristics. James even set up his own lab at Harvard.
Okay, so structure versus function. What else was brewing?
Well, over in Germany, again, you had the rise of Gestalt psychology around 1912. Key figures were Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, Wolfgang Kohler. Their main idea, the one they're famous for, is captured in that phrase.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. They argued that we don't perceive the world as just a collection of separate sensations. We actively organize sensory information into meaningful wholes or gestalts. Think about seeing a melody, not just individual notes or seeing patterns and shapes. They studied perception and applied these organizing principles to human behavior more broadly.
Okay. Meanwhile, a very different idea was taking shape. One that became hugely influential, maybe even dominant for a while. Behaviorism.
Oh, yes. This was a pretty radical shift, really championed by John B. Watson and later B.F. Skinner. Watson essentially said, forget introspection, forget consciousness, forget the unconscious mind. We can't see it. We can't measure it objectively. Psychology, he argued, should only study observable behavior, what people do.
Just the external stuff.
Just the external. They focus heavily on learning, particularly how behavior is shaped by consequences, reinforcement, and punishment. Watson emphasized conditioned responses, building on the work of Ivan Pavlov, the Russian physiologist who studied digestion in dogs and stumbled onto the conditioned reflex. Pavlov even won a Nobel Prize for his digestion work.
So behaviorism is all about what you can see and measure from the outside.
Yeah.
But completely differently, Sigmund Freud was digging into something you absolutely couldn't see, the unconscious.
Right. Freud, an Austrian physician, developed psychoanalysis. His focus was totally different. He believed that powerful unconscious motives, conflicts, and urges, often stemming from early childhood experiences, were the real drivers of our behavior and the root of many psychological problems, or nervous disorders as they called them then. He thought these hidden drives find expression in our thoughts, dreams, and actions.
And his method was psychoanalysis. Talking therapy.
Yes, using techniques like free association, just talking freely, and dream interpretation to try and uncover these unconscious influences. His ideas were, and still are, pretty controversial, but they had a profound impact on Western culture and thinking about personality and therapy. They also influenced later thinkers, the Neo-Freudians like Jung, Adler, Horney, and Erikson, who developed related psychodynamic approaches.
Okay, so we've got the structure, the function, the whole pattern, the observable behavior, and the hidden unconscious. Then the humanistic perspective came along as a sort of reaction.
You could say that. It's often called the third force in psychology, emerging as an alternative to the perceived negativity of psychoanalysis and the sort of mechanical view of behaviorism. Humanists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers were more optimistic about human nature. They emphasized people's unique ability to direct their own lives, free will, conscious choice, and the drive towards self-actualization, achieving one's full potential.
It's a very different feel from the others, more positive.
It really is. Then, moving into the 1960s and beyond, spurred partly by the rise of computers and dissatisfaction with behaviorism's limits, the cognitive perspective really gained prominence. This brought the mind back into the center stage, but in a new, more scientific way.
Like viewing the mind as an information processor. A bit like a computer.
Kind of, yeah. That was a useful analogy. Cognitive psychologists study higher-order mental processes: memory, intelligence, perception, language, problem-solving, decision-making. Think back to Ebbinghaus studying memory formation with nonsense syllables, or Sir Frederick Bartlett studying how memory is a reconstructive social process. Those were early cognitive explorations. This perspective is hugely influential today.
Okay. We also have perspectives that look outside the individual more, like the sociocultural perspective.
Right. This one emphasizes the crucial role of social context and cultural factors in shaping behavior and mental processes. It reminds us that we don't exist in a vacuum. Our environment, social norms, class, ethnicity, cultural values, all these things influence how we think, feel, and act. Research here highlights interesting differences, like how Western cultures often tend towards individualism, while many East Asian cultures lean towards collectivism and interdependence. Social psychologist Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance, that discomfort when our actions and beliefs don't align, also fits here.
And then there's the biological perspective, looking inside at the physical body.
Yep. This focuses directly on the biological underpinnings of behavior and mental processes. It investigates the role of the brain, the nervous system, hormones, brain chemicals, genetics, the glandular system. Essentially, how our biology influences who we are and what we do.
And finally, the evolutionary perspective. Back to Darwin.
Back to Darwin, in a way.
Yeah.
Inspired by his theory of natural selection, variation, inheritance, selection, evolutionary psychologists propose that many of our behavioral tendencies or predispositions, things like aggression, mate selection preferences, maybe even certain fears, might have evolved because they conferred some survival or reproductive advantage on our ancestors. They look at how evolution might have shaped our shared human psychology, though they also stress that sociocultural factors play a huge role in how these tendencies actually get expressed. David Buss is a key figure here.
Wow. Okay, so what a journey, just in terms of viewpoints. From breaking down the mind structure, to ignoring the mind for behavior, to digging into the unconscious, emphasizing potential, viewing the mind like a computer, and then looking at our culture, our biology, our evolutionary past. It really shows just how many different angles you can take to try and understand something as complex as a human being.
It absolutely does. And these different perspectives aren't just, abstract academic ideas. They directly inform the huge variety of areas where psychology is actually applied in the real world today.
Which leads us perfectly into the different subfields. The source gives a pretty long list, and it's amazing how specialized psychology gets. Before we dive into those, it clarifies the different roles, like psychologist versus psychiatrist.
Ah, yes, that's an important distinction. A psychologist typically has a doctorate degree, like a PhD or CSID, specialized training in psychology, but not a medical degree. They work in tons of different settings. A psychiatrist, on the other hand, is a medical doctor, MD, who has specialized in psychiatry. They can diagnose and treat mental disorders, and crucially, they can prescribe medication, which most psychologists cannot.
And then there's the psychiatric social worker.
Right. They usually have a master's degree in social work and often focus more on the environmental factors that might be contributing to a person's difficulties, connecting them with resources.
Okay, good clarification. Now the subfields. Fast 1.10 in the source shows where psychologists work. Looks like lots of places.
It is incredibly vast. Maybe instead of just listing every single one, we can think about the kinds of problems or areas psychologists focus on.
Okay, sounds good. Like helping people who are struggling with difficulties.
Absolutely. That's a huge area. It falls under fields like clinical psychology and counseling psychology. Clinical psychologists typically assess, diagnose, and treat more severe mental disorders, depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, and so on. They work in hospitals, clinics, private practice, sometimes research. Counseling psychologists often deal with, let's say, milder emotional or personal issues. Things like relationship problems, career choices, coping with stress, adjusting to life changes. They also use assessments like tests and interviews.
Okay. And there are psychologists focused specifically on how we learn in schools.
Yes, definitely. You have school psychologists who work directly within schools. They help students with learning difficulties or behavioral problems, consult with teachers and parents, do assessments of things like intelligence or learning disabilities. And then educational psychologists look at the broader psychology of teaching and learning. More general problems like curriculum development, improving teaching methods, understanding motivation in the classroom.
Makes sense. How about psychology in the workplace? I know that's a big area.
Huge. That's organizational psychology, sometimes called IO-Psych for industrial organizational. They apply psychological principles to work settings to enhance employee well-being and performance. They might be involved in selecting and placing employees using tests, designing training programs, improving communication, boosting job satisfaction, or researching organizational problems.
Right. And what about the psychologist doing the basic research, just trying to understand fundamental processes?
That often falls under experimental psychology. These researchers study core facets of behavior like learning, memory, sensation, perception, often using controlled experiments in lab settings, sometimes in the field. They're trying to understand the fundamental basis of behavior and thought, and sometimes develop techniques to modify behavior based on those principles. Closely related is physiological psychology, or biopsychology. They specifically investigate the relationship between the brain and behavior in both humans and animals, looking at the nervous system, hormones, genetics, the biological basis. They might use techniques like brain imaging or study effects of brain damage.
Okay, so we've got helping individuals working in education and businesses doing basic research. It feels like psychology pops up almost everywhere.
It really does, and we haven't even mentioned all of them. There's social psychology, studying how individuals think, feel, and behave in social situations, groups, relationships, attitudes, persuasion. Developmental psychology, looking at how we change across the entire lifespan, from infancy to old age, cognitively, socially, emotionally. There are newer areas, too, like community psychology, focused on community-level problems and promoting well-being in communities. Sports psychology, helping athletes enhance performance and deal with pressure. Health psychology, a really big emerging area, looking at the interplay of psychological factors, behavior, and physical health and illness. And forensic psychology, applying psychological principles within the legal and criminal justice system, criminal profiling, assessing defendants, working with victims.
Wow, the list just keeps going. It really underscores how psychology touches almost every aspect of human life.
Absolutely, because wherever there are people thinking, feeling, and behaving, psychology has something relevant to say.
And the reason we can call it a science, as we discussed earlier, is how psychologists go about studying all these things. Let's touch on the main research methods they use.
Right. It's the commitment to scientific investigation that gives psychology its scientific standing. The overall goals of this investigation are usually description, what is happening, explanation, why is it happening, prediction, when will it happen, and sometimes control. How can we influence it? Though not every study aims for all four.
Okay, so what are the basic steps they follow?
Generally, it starts with a problem or a question, often sparked by curiosity or observation, like, does screen time affect attention in kids? Then you formulate a hypothesis, which is basically a tentative explanation or a testable prediction about the relationship between variables. This is fundamental. Hypotheses lead to theory generation. Next comes testing the hypothesis. This involves designing a study, choosing a method, collecting data, analyzing it. The design could be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed.
Then you figure out what the results mean.
Exactly. Interpretation and conclusion. You look at the data, maybe using statistical analysis for quantitative data, or other methods for qualitative data to see if your hypothesis was supported or not. Statistics help find associations or differences that are unlikely to be due to chance. And finally, reporting the results. You share your findings, how you got them, what they mean. This allows others to potentially replicate the study, do it again to see if they get the same results, which builds confidence and it adds to the overall knowledge base. Replication is key. Box 1.4 mentions its importance.
Okay, steps make sense. Now, the main methods themselves. The source highlights three primary ones.
Yes. Descriptive, correlational, and experimental methods.
Let's start with descriptive. What's the goal there?
Just what it sounds like.
Yeah.
To describe what is happening, to observe and record behavior. There are a few types. One is the case study. This involves an in-depth investigation of one individual or a small group. You gather a lot of detailed information about their behavior, thoughts, emotions, history. The idea is that each person is unique. Think of Freud developing his theories based on his patients, or Jean Piaget studying cognitive development by closely observing his own children. Rokich's study, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, is another classic example.
What are the downsides?
Well, the big one is generalizability. Can you really apply findings from one unique person to everyone else? Probably not easily. And there's a risk of researcher bias influencing the interpretation.
Okay, what about surveys? That's also descriptive.
Yes. With surveys, researchers ask people questions about their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, often through questionnaires, interviews, phone calls, or online. The advantage is you can gather information from a large number of people relatively quickly. But the key requirement is that the participants must be a representative sample of the population you're interested in, often achieved through random selection.
And a disadvantage.
People might not always give truthful answers. They might want to present themselves in a positive light that's called social desirability bias.
Right. And the third descriptive method, observation.
Systematic observation. Here, the researcher carefully observes and records behavior as it occurs naturally, without manipulating anything. They might try to understand plausible reasons for the behavior based on what they see, using inductive reasoning. Principles of behavior can be developed this way. It can be difficult if there are impeding factors, which is why controlled settings like experiments are sometimes easier. Observation often supplements data from other methods. A specific type is naturalistic observation, watching humans or animals in their normal environment. like shoppers in a mall or birds at a feeder.
Okay, so descriptive methods tell you what is happening. But what if you want to know if two things are related? Like, are taller people smarter or are happier people healthier?
Now you're moving into the correlational method. This method looks for relationships between two or more variables. It measures how strongly two things tend to vary together. You collect data on two different measures from the same group of people, like height and IQ scores, or maybe data on one measure from two related groups.
So you're seeing if scores on one variable go along with scores on another.
Exactly. Does an increase in one score tend to be associated with an increase or a decrease in the other score? We use a statistical procedure to calculate this relationship, resulting in a correlation coefficient, usually represented by R.
And that R tells you the strength and direction.
Precisely. It ranges from plus 1.0 to minus 1.0. A plus 1.0 means a perfect positive correlation as one variable increases, the other increases perfectly in SWIP. High scores go with high scores. Minus 1.0 means a perfect negative correlation as one variable increases, the other decreases perfectly. High scores go with low scores. And a correlation of 0 means there's absolutely no relationship between the two variables. Knowing the score on one tells you nothing about the score on the other.
And if there is a strong correlation, say close to plus 1 or -1, you can make predictions.
Yes. That's a key use of correlation. If intelligence and happiness had a correlation of, say, plus 0.8, which would be very high, you could predict with some confidence that a highly intelligent person is likely to be quite happy. If the correlation was 0, knowing someone's intelligence wouldn't help you predict their happiness at all.
The source mentions scattergrams for visualizing this.
Right. Figure 1.11 shows that. A scattergram plots each person's score on both variables as a point on a graph. Just by looking at the pattern of dots, you can often get a visual sense of the direction, uphill for positive, downhill for negative, and the strength, how tightly clustered the points are, of the correlation.
And this is the big warning label with correlation, right? It doesn't tell you about cause and effect.
Absolutely crucial point. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one causes the other.
The classic example. Ice cream sales and crime rates are positively correlated. But eating ice cream doesn't cause crime.
And committing crimes doesn't make people suddenly crave ice cream. There's a third variable, hot weather, that likely causes both to increase. Correlation tells you things are related, but not why.
So if you really want to nail down whether one thing causes another, you need a different approach.
You need the experimental method. This is generally considered the gold standard for determining cause and effect. In an experiment, the researcher actively manipulates one or more factors. These are called the independent variables, 4 V's, and then observes whether this manipulation causes a change in some behavior or mental process. That's the dependent variable, the AV, because its value depends on what happens with the IV.
Can you give a simple example again?
Sure. Let's say you want to test if caffeine improves memory recall. The HAV would be the caffeine invest. The researcher manipulates it by giving one group a caffeinated drink and another group a non-caffeinated drink, a placebo. The DV would be their score on a memory test afterwards. You measure this to see if the caffeine had an effect.
And you have to control everything else, like making sure the groups are similar to begin with.
Exactly. You need to control for extraneous factors, other variables that could potentially influence the DV, like time of day, noise levels, prior sleep. Researchers use experimental designs to do this. A common one is the control group design. You have an experimental group that gets the IV, the caffeine, and a control group that doesn't, the placebo. You try to make the groups as similar as possible beforehand, for example, through random assignment. If there's a significant difference in memory scores between the groups later, you can be more confident it was caused by the caffeine. The control group provides a baseline for comparison.
Are there other designs?
Yes. Sometimes a within-group design is used. You measure the participants' baseline performance before introducing the IV, and then measure it again after. The participant acts as their own control. This works best if the effect of the IV isn't long-lasting. There's also an ABA design, measure baseline, A, introduce the IV and measure B, then remove the IV and measure again, A. This helps confirm the effect was really due to the IV.
And experiments need to be replicable.
Yes, a hallmark of good experimental science is replicability. Others should be able to repeat the experiment and, ideally, get similar results.
What are the limitations of experiments, though?
Well, sometimes it's unethical or impractical to manipulate certain variables. You can't ethically assign children to stressful versus non-stressful homes, for example. The source mentions ethical considerations for both human and animal research in Box 1.4. Also, the controlled lab setting can sometimes be artificial. Do findings from a tightly controlled lab experiment always generalize to the complexities of real life? Maybe not perfectly. And there's always a slight risk the experimenter's expectations could subtly influence the results, though researchers use techniques like double-blind procedures to minimize that.
Okay, so descriptive methods for what, correlational for how things relate, and experimental for what causes what, those are the main tools in the psychologist's toolkit.
They are indeed. And while these methods, and many of the schools of thought we discussed, largely originated in the West, particularly Europe and North America, it's important to remember that psychology has developed and taken root globally, including, as the source highlights, in India.
Right. The source notes that psychology in India initially drew heavily on Western theories and models. But there's a growing interest, it seems, in connecting the discipline to the inherent knowledge within Indian traditions and texts.
Yes, exactly. Someone named Dalal pointed out in 2010 that the discipline didn't initially tap into the rich potential for theories of self and human development found in Indian scriptures. The formal start of academic psychology in India is usually traced to the University of Calcutta in 1916. Though the syllabus was actually prepared earlier, around 1905, by Sir Brajendra Nath Seal, the first faculty member was Dr. N.N. Sengupta, a scholar who had trained at Harvard.
And there was an interesting early figure mentioned, Girindra Shekhar Bose, who actually tried to blend Western psychoanalysis with Indian thought.
Yes, Bose was really a pioneer. He was a psychoanalyst, the first president of the Indian Psychoanalytic Society, founded in 1922. And his doctoral thesis back in 1921, Concept of Repression, famously blended Freudian concepts with ideas from Hindu thought. That's a fascinating early example of trying to bridge those cultural perspectives.
So Calcutta started it off in 1916. Then it expanded to other universities like Mysore in 1924.
Right. And you saw the establishment of formal structures quite early. The Indian Psychological Association was established in 1924, and the Indian Journal of Psychology, started in 1926, noted it as being quite advanced for its time.
And then more universities followed. Aligarh Muslim University, Madras University of Delhi eventually got its own department.
Yes, Delhi initially had masters in psychology within philosophy in 57, then an independent department in 64 under Professor Ganguly, and key institutions were established, like the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore in 1974, which is a major center. Professor Durganand Sinha also started a department at Allahabad University in 1961.
So what's the focus now in Indian psychology, according to the source?
The trend seems to be towards studying human behavior using indigenous techniques and methods, drawing from India's own cultural and philosophical heritage, alongside continuing to engage with Western models. It's about developing a psychology that is more culturally relevant. The source also mentions several significant Indian journals and prominent associations, showing a vibrant field.
And lists quite a few influential Indian psychologists.
Yes, names like H.S. Astana, Anand Paranjay, J.B.P. Sinha, D. Sinha, Ashish Nandi, Sudhir Kakar, Girishwar Misra, Janak Pandey, T.S. Saraswati, among others. It signals a rich history and ongoing contribution.
That makes a lot of sense. Given how influential culture is, as the sociocultural perspective highlighted, it seems crucial for psychology to evolve and incorporate diverse insights from places like India to get a truly global understanding of human experience.
It definitely enriches the field. It challenges assumptions that might be based primarily on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic or weird populations, as some researchers call them.
Okay, wow. We have covered a lot of ground. We've journeyed from ancient Greek philosophy right up to modern science, navigated through some pretty fierce debates between different ways of seeing the mind and behavior, explored the huge array of places psychology is actually applied, and looked at how researchers investigate things, even touching on the field's specific history and development in India.
It really is a field that's constantly evolving, isn't it? Still grappling with those fundamental questions of who we are, why we do what we do. It uses rigorous scientific methods, but at the same time has to acknowledge the incredible complexity and diversity of human life.
Yeah, seeing this whole picture, how it started, with these huge philosophical questions, tried to become a hard science, kind of fragmented into all these different schools arguing about what matters most.
Yeah.
And is now applied practically everywhere while also trying to become more globally inclusive.
It really just underscores that understanding ourselves, understanding human behavior isn't some simple finished puzzle. It's very much an ongoing quest.
So, thinking about that whole journey, Psychology's roots in both philosophy and biology, its evolution through so many different schools of thought that often sharply disagreed, and how it's expanding into all these practical areas while trying to incorporate diverse perspectives like those from India. What does that whole complex, sometimes messy evolution tell you about just how challenging it is to truly understand human behavior and mental life? And maybe how might bringing together all these different pieces, the biological, the cognitive, the social, the cultural, the historical, shape the future of how we try to figure ourselves out?
That's definitely a lot to ponder there. Gives you perspective.
It really does. Well, thank you so much for sharing this material with us and joining us for this deep dive today. And for you listening, maybe keep observing the world, and perhaps even more importantly, keep observing yourself with a bit of a psychological lens. You might just see things a little differently now.